The Technology History Podcast. Exciting stories about the development of technology by Christian Steinbach. Hi everybody and welcome to episode number 5 in English of the Technology History Podcast. This is a final episode about the American Space Shuttle program. If you haven't heard the previous ones, it makes sense to listen to them first. This last part will now be about the missions after the Challenger disaster in 1986, in which top technical achievements were achieved well into the 2000s.
3, 2, 1, 0, and liftoff! Liftoff. Americans return to space as Discovery clears the tower.
This was a recording of the first space shuttle launch after the Challenger exploded just 73 seconds after liftoff on 1/28/1986, killing all 7 crew members. By this launch of the Space Shuttle Discovery on 9/26/1988, over 2.5 years had passed since the accident. After the Challenger explosion, all missions were immediately put on hold and extensive investigations were carried out. Finally, the cause of the accident was found. The low temperature in the freezing area before launch, which is not exactly common in Florida, had caused a sealing ring in one of the 2 booster rockets to become so brittle that hot gases could escape from this point, damaging the external tank, which ultimately led to the explosion. What is particularly tragic is the fact that the 7 astronauts were probably consciously aware of the moment of the accident and may not have died until the cabin hit the sea surface. It is also noteworthy that shortly before the start, an engineer warned about exactly this problem. However, because they were so behind schedule, they decided to start anyway. The engineer mentioned above breathed a sigh of relief at the start because, according to his own statements, he had already expected an explosion at the moment of ignition. The rest, as they say in such places, is history. Of course, there was particularly great excitement in September 1988 when the shuttle program was to be continued with Discovery after the long interruption. When the space shuttle landed safely again on 9/30/1988, after a successful mission, there was a huge sigh of relief. The return to business was successful. However, the schedule for the scheduled missions had been pushed back considerably due to the long break. The Hubble Space Telescope, which was supposed to offer humanity an unprecedented insight into the depths of space, was only launched into space by Discovery in April 1990. After the start, the disappointment was huge. The incredibly expensive giant telescope had successfully reached its place in space, but after it was put into operation, it only sent blurry images. Therefore, in December 1993, the Space Shuttle Endeavour took off on a repair mission. The Endeavour was built after the Challenger disaster in order to fly the missions that the Challenger was actually intended for. This is where the shuttle concept demonstrated its real and unique ability at the time. They flew to the telescope and captured it with a robot arm. Astronauts then climbed out and made necessary repairs before deploying Hubble again. By the way, 4 more missions took place during which the Hubble telescope was maintained and upgraded, the last one in May 2009. And SpaceX is checking whether the Crew Dragon spacecraft can continue to fly maintenance missions. Hubble could complement its successor, the James Webb Telescope, for some time to come. But back to the space shuttles. Another flight that had to be postponed after the Challenger accident was a second German shuttle mission, or D2 mission for short, in 1993. As with the D1 mission in 1985, 2 German astronauts were there, in addition to the Space Lab Research Laboratory. I was able to get to know one of the 2, Hans Schlegel, personally after lecture in Mannheim. However, the nice older gentleman didn't really want to buy the fact that, as a 13 years old, I was eagerly following the countdown on the car radio, which then had to be cancelled immediately before takeoff due to an engine failure. A month later, the start went smoothly. In addition to the D2 mission, there's one in particular that I remember. A flight of the Atlantis in 1995, when an American space shuttle docked with the Russian space station Mir for the first time. Of course, there were no internet live streams back then, but I still remember the news showing the two commanders shaking hands after opening the hatch. When the Endeavour launched in December 1998, it had a module of the International Space Station ISS on board for the first time, which the astronauts connected to a previously launched Russian module. This is how the construction of the ISS began, to which more and more modules were gradually added. After the turn of the millennium, almost all subsequent shuttle missions were intended to serve the construction and operation of the International Space Station. One of the few exceptions was a Columbia mission in 2003. On its 28th flight, the longest-serving shuttle was once again on a scientific mission. What initially went unnoticed, during takeoff, a piece of the tank insulation came loose and hit the left edge of the Columbia's wing. The next day, the incident was discovered during routine video analysis of the liftoff phase, but was not classified as critical. When the space shuttle returned to Earth after 2.5 weeks, after a successful research mission, the accident happened. 16 minutes before the scheduled touchdown on the runway at Cape Canaveral in Florida, the Columbia disintegrated over Texas after the high re-entry heat penetrated the area on the left wing that had been damaged by the tank insulation mentioned above. It had destroyed the structure of the shuttle starting from the left wing to such an extent that the space shuttle finally broke apart and rained down on Texas in the form of small fragments. I can still remember that day well. I was studying for a test when my mother-in-law informed me about it. When I turned on the television, meteoric falling fragments were already to see. Somehow it was immediately clear to me that this misfortune would really be the beginning of the end. But that has nothing to do with clairvoyant abilities. One must not forget, at this point the technology was already 3 decades old. And somehow it almost seemed a bit absurd that at a time when cell phones and the internet were already part of everyday life, the spearhead of technological development, NASA, was still flying into space using 1970s technology. As with the Challenger, 7 astronauts were killed, and again, shuttle operations were put on hold for a long time. It was not until 7/26/2005 that another space shuttle, Discovery, was launched into space. There were 20 more missions before a space shuttle was launched into space for the very last time on 7/8/2011, the Atlantis. The USA no longer had its own manned spacecraft for almost 9 years. Instead, the Americans flew to the ISS in Russian Soyuz capsules. It was not until 5/20/2020 that an American crew launched into space again in an American spacecraft, the SpaceX Crew Dragon Endeavour. Meanwhile, the shuttles that have outlived their active time have become popular attractions in various museums. As mentioned in the first episode, the Enterprise prototype, which was never launched into space, can be viewed today in New York. The Discovery can be admired in Washington, D.C., the Atlantis in the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, and the Endeavour in Los Angeles. What remains is a memory of a vision of cheap, safe, and almost everyday space travel that the Space Shuttle program was not able to fulfill completely. Not to be forgotten, however, are the many space travel successes that were achieved over a period of no less than 3 decades. With this, I conclude episode number 5 in English of the Technology History podcast about the later missions of the Space Shuttle. If you enjoyed the podcast, I would be very happy about a subscription. And maybe you know someone who is also interested in this topic and to whom you would like to recommend my podcast. Finally, my thanks go to Walk-In Music from Pixabay, whose song I was allowed to incorporate into the intro. Thank you for your interest and see you next time on the Technology History Podcast.